The napkin had a gold, stitched border and a scent of truffle oil I couldn't place. I sat alone near the kitchen door, close enough to hear the hiss of steam and metal pans clashing. Far enough from the main table, where my son Neil and his friends clinked glasses over mimosas. Heather had arranged the brunch. It was a modern celebration, she said. Long banquet tables, locally sourced food, and 30 people. Only 5 of whom I actually knew. I glanced at my watch. 10 past noon. No one had brought out a cake. No one had asked me anything. Heather was radiant as always, hair smooth, blouse cream colored with pearl buttons. She spoke to the woman beside her, some city council member or marketing executive, like a hostess on television. Neil stood behind her, tall, confident, sipping champagne. They hadn't looked at me since I arrived. I adjusted my sweater sleeve. The navy wool itched. I had worn it because it was my husband Robert's favorite. It still smelled faintly of lavender, the kind I used in the linen drawers when he was alive. The waitress approached with a hesitant smile. "Would you like another orange juice, ma'am?" I shook my head. "No, dear. Just the check, if there is one." The waitress blushed. "Oh, I think it's all taken care of course. Neil always covered things, and lately, they made sure I remembered it." He strolled over minutes later, drink in hand, cheeks flushed with whatever they'd been toasting. "Hey, Mom." He leaned in, gave me a quick hug that felt like a gesture for show. "Having fun. Trying," I said, smiling tightly. "You look great," he said, glancing at the corner where my chair scraped the wall. "Glad you came." I was about to respond when he added, louder this time, "Hope you're enjoying all the stuff we pay for." A couple of heads turned. One man chuckled. Heather, still at the table, raised her glass in what must have been her version of support. Neil looked straight at me. "You're lucky we still pay for you, Mom." The room quieted. Just a little, just enough. I looked down at the manila folder resting on my lap. I had brought it because something in my gut told me to. A whisper from Robert, maybe. Or just instinct. I reached in, lifted the folder slowly, and placed it on the table between us. "What's this?" Neil asked, laughing still. "The deed?" I said softly. "The one you thought you had control of." His smile faltered. I opened the folder and slid out the original paper. Yellowed edges, embossed seal intact. Lillian R. O'Connell, sole owner since March 1982. His name was nowhere on it. Heather's, not a trace. Neil blinked, mouth open. I thought. "Heather said you." I stood. My knees ached, but not enough to stop me now. "I may be 72, Neil," I said, my voice low. "But I still remember who I am, and what I own." Heather approached, voice tight. "Maybe this isn't the time." "No," I said. "This is exactly the time." The guests weren't sure whether to look away or keep watching. They did both, quietly chewing their scones, pretending their phones buzzed. I picked up my purse, tucked the folder back in, and turned toward the door. And as I walked out, I didn't feel old. I felt like someone who'd finally remembered where she put her spine. The brunch faded behind me, laughter thinning, utensils clinking. But inside my chest, something solid had returned. I didn't go straight home after the brunch. Instead, I stopped by the little war memorial on Walnut Street. Robert's name was on the plaque behind the flagpole. Not because he died in combat, but because he served, and this town hadn't forgotten those who did. I sat on the bench nearby, let my fingers trace the edge of my coat. The February wind slipped under my collar, but I didn't button it. I wanted to feel something, even if it was just cold. A mother walked by with 2 children in puffy coats. One of them pointed at the statue. "Mom, what's that lady holding?" "An old medical bag," she answered. "She's a nurse." The little girl scrunched her nose. "Like Grandma." I closed my eyes. It was 1982 when Robert and I moved into that house by the thicket. He was 36, just back from the fabrication line at the rail yard, hands still dark with oil no soap could scrub out. "This land's no palace," he'd said, patting the muddy ground. "But we'll build it into something strong." And we did. Piece by piece. Weekend by weekend. While I worked nights as an RN at the county hospital, he laid the floors. When Neil was born, we didn't have a crib. We kept him in a second-hand bassinet we'd traded our anniversary clock for. But we never once felt poor. I remembered holding Robert's hand the night we found out. Lung cancer, stage IV. He smiled through the morphine haze. Promise me something, Lil. Anything. Don't sell the land. Not unless it's for you. I promised. I meant it. After he passed, everything got quieter. Too quiet. Neil had been 20 at the time. Junior at university, already pulling away in ways I didn't yet have words for. He cried at the funeral. He held my hand. Then he left 2 days later, citing midterms. I didn't fault him. Not then. I got a second job, triage at the VA clinic. Took night shifts at the urgent care too. Whatever kept the roof solid and Neil's tuition paid. One night in 2004, I came home to find a busted heater and a frozen pipe. I wrapped my legs in towels and boiled water to make tea. But the power went out. I remember huddling by the gas stove with a single candle and Robert's army jacket wrapped around my shoulders. That night, I whispered to the dark, I don't need help, I just need 1 more year. The next morning, I went out and took an extra shift. That was the rhythm. That was the sacrifice. Not heroic, just endless. Neil never saw that version of me. Or maybe he did, and chose to forget it. Now here we were, me, still alive. Still in the same house, and him? Calling it ours. The deed sat on my lap now, tucked into the same manila folder I'd carried through 5 apartments before we built the house. Robert's signature still bold. My maiden name carefully initialed in ink that had faded to a dusty brown. Neil had never asked to see it. He assumed, like so many sons do, that the world rearranged itself for their convenience. And I had let him believe it, until now. That evening, back home, I made my tea the old-fashioned way, kettle on the stovetop, no Keurig nonsense. The kitchen window fogged with steam as I stood there, watching dusk settle over the field behind the house. Heather had texted, sorry if Neil's joke upset you. He meant well. Let's talk soon. I didn't reply. I didn't need their words. I needed to feel my own breath slow again, to sit at my own table and remember that silence didn't mean absence. It meant peace. I lit the lamp in the living room. Opened the drawer Robert had carved himself. Inside, I found the envelope I'd sealed 10 years ago, in case something happens. It held everything, insurance, will, copies of the VA loan, and now I slipped the deed inside. It was time I stopped waiting to be respected. That night, as the heater hummed low and steady, I opened my checkbook. Not because I owed anyone, but because starting tomorrow, I'd be untangling every account they ever touched. I should have known better. The first time Neil mentioned a joint account, we were standing in the parking lot of the hardware store, fall leaves skittering around our feet like nervous paper. He held the receipt for new porch railings, waving it like proof of his goodwill. Let me just set something up for you, Mom. Online banking, easy access, recurring payments. You shouldn't be worrying about bills at your age. At your age. That phrase always landed like a soft slap, framed as care, wrapped in convenience, but hollowed by the presumption that I couldn't keep up. Still, I nodded. He was my son. He'd gone to college, wore tailored jackets, said things like, asset leverage. And honestly, the idea of logging into one more website made my temples pulse. So I let him do it. Heather came by 2 days later with a tablet and a folder. She wore white, like always. She liked to project clean. This is just a simple document authorizing Neil to help manage utilities and tax forms, she said, uncapping a pen with that slick lawyer calm. You'll still be the primary, of course. I didn't read every line. I'd never needed to read fine print with Robert. We built trust on sweat and shared sacrifice, not on clauses and PDF footnotes. I signed. Heather smiled and reached for the paper like a nurse collecting vitals. It'll make everything so much easier. For a while, it did. Bills were paid. The trash company never missed a week. My prescriptions arrived on time. Neil even started sending me a monthly support transfer, $300, then $500, then $750. He never said it out loud, but I could feel the subtext. We're helping you. I said thank you. I cooked Sunday dinner. I smiled like it didn't sting. But then came the brunch. The way he said it was still pay for you. Like I was a dependent. A case file. A good deed in a suit pocket. I remembered what Ray once told me back when we were stationed at Fort Belvoir. The friendliest trap is the one that comes with flowers and gentle hands. That Monday, I walked into the credit union branch on Maple Avenue. The same place I'd opened an account in 1981, the year before Neil was born. The teller's name was Sarah. She wore a pin shaped like a cardinal. I'd like to see the status of account 932. Under the name Lillian R. O'Connell, I said, placing my ID on the counter. She smiled, then frowned. There's actually a joint party listed on this file. Neil O'Connell. Would you like to remove that access? I blinked. I'd like to know when he was added. She tilted the monitor. Looks like September 2020, online authorization. Do you recall doing that? I didn't. Not directly, but I remembered Heather and her tablet. And that pen. That night, I pulled out my ledger. Robert and I had kept a habit of writing down every expense, no matter how small. He used blue ink. I switched to black after he passed. The pages trembled in my hands as I realized how far I'd drifted from that discipline. 3 years of assuming, trusting, handing off responsibility. There were charges I didn't recognize. A 92 subscription to something called HOMSIS Premium, the 542 MD Care Advisor, and a first 200 withdrawal labeled Property Survey Advance. Survey for my land. The next morning, I called Ray. He still worked at the municipal planning office part-time, mostly filing records and reviewing development applications. Lil, he said, voice warm as ever. I was hoping you'd call. I didn't even have to ask the question. He'd already pulled the file. Someone submitted a pre-zoning inquiry on your parcel in January. They used your name. But the email, it's Hither's. I closed my eyes. I thought it might be a mistake, he said. But then a land use rep came by asking if the owners were open to early offers. Early offers, I repeated. They're extending Route 22. The bypass will cut through the back quarter of your lot. You'd get, well, let's just say it's a number with 6 zeros. I couldn't speak. Not because I was shocked by the money, but because I finally saw the whole picture. They hadn't just wanted to help with bills. They wanted the land. That night, I turned off all the lights, sat at the kitchen table with nothing but my old lantern glowing like a wartime relic. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I planned. By Friday, I'd opened a brand new trust account under my maiden name. The first deposit, a notarized copy of the deed. The second, my father's watch. Not because it was worth anything, but because I wanted something inside that vault to remind me. I wasn't born powerless. I won't die that way either. The woman behind the records counter wore thick glasses and a red wool scarf. Her name tag read, Bethany, and her keyboard clicks echoed across the county clerk's office like woodpeckers in a hollow tree. I handed her the parcel number scrawled on a yellow post. She squinted at it, typed slowly, then tilted her head. Not the sound you want from someone looking up legal documents on your land. What is it? I asked. Well, she said, chewing her bottom lip, the record shows the original title, Lillian R. O'Connell, sole owner, established March 18, 1982. She glanced up. That's still current. I nodded. But. And she tapped again. There's a secondary document pending. It's a preliminary transfer form. Not official, but flagged for legal review. My stomach tightened. Pending from whom? She turned the monitor slightly. Heather N. O'Connell. Submitted online. Signature box, digitally signed with verbal consent of grantor. I felt cold behind my knees. Verbal consent. I had given none. Bethany continued, frowning. Looks like it hasn't been approved. But if no one flags it, the system assumes default confirmation within 90 days. I leaned closer, my voice steady. How many days in? She clicked again. 70. 2. I exhaled slowly. 18 days left before the county assumed I'd willingly handed over the title. When I got home, I opened the cabinet beneath the old tea tins and pulled out the safe deposit key, smooth brass, cool against my palm. Inside that deposit box were two things I valued above all: my wedding ring, which I hadn't worn in years, the original deed, hand-signed, sealed, and filed back when Robert and I were still arguing over what color to stain the deck. I drove to the credit union the next morning. The clerk led me to the vault with the reverence of a librarian opening a first edition Hemingway. When I opened the envelope and slid the deed out, the corner curled from the humidity. But the ink had not faded. I had proof, and now I needed protection. Ray was waiting for me at the diner near his office. The kind of place that still served creamed chipped beef and played Sinatra on loop. He was already halfway through a BLT. "I figured you'd be here," he said, patting the seat across from him. "Saw the record myself. Brought this for you." He handed me a manila envelope. Inside, a printed copy of the unauthorized transfer. An email Heather had sent to a real estate consultant. What a signed survey request for my property, with a forged version of my signature. Sloppy, but close enough. "They didn't think you'd dig," he said. "Most people don't. They rely on silence and time." I folded the papers carefully. "They're running out of both." That night, I wrote 2 letters. One to the county clerk's office, formally contesting the transfer and revoking all verbal authorization. And one to my lawyer, a man named Tom McCabe, who once represented my neighbor in a probate mess that would have made a soap opera writer blush. I didn't mention anything to Neil or Heather. They were expecting me to simmer in silence, to play the role of grateful, aging mother too proud to make a fuss. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I spent 22 years in military hospitals advocating for soldiers with missing limbs and broken futures. Silence was never my specialty. 3 days later, Tom called. "You weren't kidding, Mrs. O'Connell," he said, voice tight. "This isn't just about a forged signature. Heather filed an advance claim for eminent domain compensation in your name." I sat down. "She told the office you had Alzheimer's, that you couldn't manage your affairs, ceded verbal deterioration, and filed a petition to be your guardian in advance of state action." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "She's smart," I said. "Just not smart enough." I faxed over my medical clearance the next morning. Clean, fully competent. Vision corrected, blood pressure steady, mind intact. Tom filed an emergency injunction that afternoon. Heather's guardian request was frozen. The county's 90-day default period canceled. The transfer flag erased, and just like that, the foundation beneath their scheme crumbled. I opened my window that night. The February air sliced through the screen. Far in the distance, I heard coyotes. The scent of cedar and melting snow drifted in, like the breath of a land still fighting to stay wild. I whispered to the night, "You kept your promise, Robert. Now I'm keeping mine." A letter came the next morning, embossed with a city seal. Inside, a single sentence: "Your property has been reclassified as essential for public works acquisition. Estimated compensation, $1.47 million. I didn't smile. Not yet, but I folded the paper gently and slid it beside the deed in my drawer. And then, I picked up the phone to call a realtor of my own. The wind knocked against the side of the house all night. It wasn't a storm, not quite, but one of those Pennsylvania gusts that crept through windows, whistled through chimney cracks, and made you think of things you hadn't in years. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at the old oak dining table, the one Robert built when Neil was 5. My tea had long gone cold. The city envelope with the $1.47 million figure sat open beside my elbow. The number looked like a typo. It should have felt like victory. But instead, it felt like a funeral. I reached for the box under the buffet. Thin, flat, wrapped in waxed paper. Inside was Robert's army jacket, still bearing the faint smell of diesel and tobacco. I pressed my cheek against it, even as my bones protested. The ache wasn't from the cold. We met in 1972, outside a VFW fundraiser where I was volunteering as a medic. He'd just returned from a 2-month reserve rotation and was handing out flyers with oil, stained fingers, and a smile that could melt asphalt. "You stitched up my cousin Larry last summer," he said, grinning. "He swears you yelled at him harder than the drill sergeant." "Did he deserve it?" I asked. "Absolutely. He proposed a year later with a pawn shop ring and a pack of lifesavers." "I can't offer you much," he'd said, "but I'll build you everything." He kept that promise. Nail by nail, brick by blistered brick. Even after we lost the baby in '77, even when my mother moved in and forgot both our names within the year. He was never loud, never boastful, but he was always there, holing lumber, warming soup, kissing my temple when I swore I couldn't do another double shift. I remembered the night he came home from the clinic, the scan results tucked inside his flannel coat. He didn't hand me the papers right away. Just sat beside me on the porch swing and took my hand. "Don't let anyone touch this land," he said. "Not unless they know what it's worth." "I won't," I whispered. "Even Neil." He paused, watching our boy in the yard. 16 years old, wild hair, engine grease on his jeans. "Especially Neil," he said. "He's good. But he forgets." I think that's what hurt the most. Not the money, not the trickery, but the forgetting. The erasure of years where I bled my fingers, raw cleaning medical trays, packed lunches with single slices of bologna, ironed hand, me-down shirts so Neil wouldn't feel poor. He didn't just forget what I gave. He forgot who I was. I lit a fire in the hearth by sunrise. The room warmed slowly, casting orange across the wall where our wedding photo still hung. I stared at it for a long time. "You said to protect it, Rob," I murmured. But I didn't think I'd have to protect it from our own son. The tea kettle squealed behind me. I poured a fresh cup, strong, bitter, no sugar, just the way Robert liked it. I placed it across from me like I used to. Old habits die slowly, if at all. Then I reached for my notebook. Lined pages, spiral, bound, smell of ink and dust. I titled the first page in block letters, "Contingency Plan in Case of Son." I made a list. Remove Neil's name from any account he still touches. Secure deed in private legal trust. A finalized sale of back, lot parcel only. Retain upper parcel with creek plant dogwood. The right letter for Neil. Not now. For later. I paused after that last item. I didn't know if I still wanted to explain. But Robert always believed in the power of a last word. The mail came at noon. One envelope caught my eye. A thank you card. Ivory stock. Inside a note from a former patient's daughter. "You held my mother's hand when we couldn't. You told her she wasn't alone. I never forgot." I read it 3 times. Then I smiled. That's legacy, not land, not zeros, not brunches with mimosas and cold laughter. But a name whispered with warmth in someone else's memory. That evening, I stood on the porch in Robert's jacket. I looked across the land he swore to protect. The evergreens lining the edge, the fence posts we replaced with scavenged lumber, the swing still hanging from a crooked branch. It was mine. Because I loved it. Because I remembered. Because I stayed when it got hard. And because Robert believed I would. I took one last sip of tea and folded the letter from the patient's daughter. Tomorrow, I'd meet with the city representative. Not to sell it all. Just the parts I was ready to let go. The rest I'd leave behind for someone who deserved to remember. Heather opened the front door with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't expect you to actually come," she said, stepping aside. "I wasn't planning to," I replied, brushing snow off my sleeves. But then I remembered. It's still my name on the mailbox. The foyer smelled like vanilla candles and lemon cleaner. Music played softly in the background. Jazzy Christmas classics, even though it was already February. I looked down. My boots were wet, dripping onto their polished hardwood floor. "Good." Heather gestured toward the dining room. "Everyone's just finishing drinks." Everyone. That meant at least a dozen people I didn't know. I counted voices, laughter, the occasional high, pitched cackle from one of Heather's charity friends. I walked slowly, scanning the place. Clean, curated, cold. Neil stood at the head of the long table, whiskey glass in hand, mid-anecdote. He froze when he saw me. "Mom," he said quickly, too quickly. "You made it." I nodded once. "You invited me." He chuckled, but his smile twitched. "Of course. Always." The guests glanced at each other. Heather moved to Neil's side like a publicist ready to spin. I set my purse down on a console table near the window and reached inside. Same manila folder. This time thicker. Neil cleared his throat. "Let's get you a drink. Coffee. Tea." "I'll have what you're having," I said. "But first, let's clear something up." I pulled out 3 items and placed them on the tablecloth in front of him, one by one. The certified copy of the deed, with my sole ownership highlighted. A printed email Heather had sent to a developer titled, "Timing the offer, elder consent expected." The city's reclassification notice, addressed to me alone. The room hushed. Heather reached forward, her voice tight. "Lillian, this isn't the time." "No," I said calmly. "This is exactly the time." Neil picked up the deed like it was burning him. His fingers trembled. "You knew," I said, "about the fake authorization, about the survey filed without my signature. You were part of it." I thought you'd be okay with it," he mumbled. "You weren't using the land. I was living on it." "You don't need that much space," Heather interjected. "You said you wanted to downsize." "No," I snapped, and the crack in my voice made even the ice in their drinks seem to pause. "I said I didn't want to shovel the driveway anymore." "That's not an invitation to erase me." I looked around the table at their guests. Some looked away. Others watched me, like spectators at a match that had taken a darker turn. I turned back to Neil. "You said I was lucky you paid for me." I let the words settle like dust, but I was paying for all of it. The water, the taxes, the groceries. With money I earned and didn't tell you about. Neil looked stunned. "You assumed silence meant poverty," I continued. "But silence was me being tired. Not empty." Heather folded her arms. "This is humiliating. Couldn't you have just called us?" I turned to her, level. "You tried to take land that wasn't yours. Lied to a county office. Faked a signature, and you want a phone call." Ray entered from the hallway then, as planned. Khaki coat, leather folder in hand. "Evening," he said to the room. "Sorry for the intrusion, but as of this morning, the city's legal team received a copy of Mrs. O'Connell's affidavit and counterclaim. She's retained counsel and submitted a protective clause for the homestead parcel." He laid a notarized form on the table. "Which means the property can't be touched by anyone without her written consent." Neil sank into his chair. Heather whispered something sharp under her breath. Ray smiled politely. "Oh, and Mrs. O'Connell has agreed to sell the back acre only. The portion along Route 22. The deal is in negotiation with the city. Early numbers suggest a valuation near $1.5 million. A beat. Then silence. Then, I stood slowly, folded my copy of the deed, slid the folder back into my purse. "I didn't come here to shame you," I said, softer now. "I came to remind you that I remember everything. I remember how I built that home. How your father and I laid the kitchen tile ourselves while Neil played with a plastic hammer in the corner." My voice caught, but I kept going. "I remember when you got the flu in 2nd grade, and I slept on the floor beside your bed for 4 nights straight. I remember selling my wedding ring to cover your college textbooks." I looked up, but I also remember betrayal. I stepped toward the door, Ray behind me. Before leaving, I turned to Neil one last time. "You still have time to choose who you want to be. But you'll have to do it without my silence." And then I left them sitting in that perfect dining room, surrounded by wine, marble, and the weight of a mother's memory. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet in a way I could breathe with. Not the silence of being dismissed, not the kind that creeps in after a missed call or an invitation that never came. No, this silence felt earned. I made coffee the next morning, black and bitter, and sipped it by the kitchen window. The porch light still flickered every few minutes. I hadn't bothered to fix it. There was something honest in the imperfection. Across the street, the Mertzes were unloading groceries. The mail carrier waved. No one asked about the party. Small towns know how to let things settle. My phone stayed still on the counter all day. No texts from Neil. No voicemail from Heather. Not even a forwarded meme. I didn't mind. Let the silence speak for a while. That week, I walked to the bank and closed the joint account. I'd opened a new one in my maiden name 2 weeks prior. Quietly, without drama, without warning. The teller didn't blink when I said I wanted every penny transferred out. She just nodded and offered me a complimentary pen. A small gesture, but it felt ceremonial. The next stop was the credit union. Vault access. One last check. The deed. The new trust paperwork. A copy of Robert's will. Yes, the original still carried my name. The woman behind the glass asked if I wanted to shred the older documents. I smiled, folded them gently, and slid them back into the folder. No, dear. Some things deserve to be kept, even if they hurt. By Friday, I'd received an envelope from Tom, my lawyer. Inside, confirmation that the city had accepted my offer to sell the back acre of the property. They would wire the first half of the payment into my personal trust within 30 days. After taxes and legal fees, I would still walk away with over $740,000. I placed the letter next to my teacup and stared at it. No one had to know. No announcement. No party. No social media post. I had done what needed to be done. Quietly, precisely, without breaking a single thing. On Sunday, I skipped church. Instead, I cleaned out the upstairs closet. Something I hadn't done since Robert passed. I found the sweater he wore on our last Thanksgiving together. A photo of Neil as a baby, gummy grin and one sock missing. An envelope addressed to Lillian, in Robert's handwriting. I hadn't seen that in years. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single page, yellowed and brittle. Lil, if I ever leave you too soon, don't let them talk you out of what you know is right. That land, that house, it's more than wood. It's our story. If Neil ever forgets that, remind him, not with anger, but with truth. Your strength was always the quiet kind. That's the kind that lasts. I love you. R. I folded the letter with shaking hands and sat on the bed for a long time. On Monday, a letter arrived from Heather. Cream stationery, gold embossed initials, scented faintly of lilac. The kind of letter that tries too hard to be soft. Lillian, I regret how things have unfolded. My intentions were only ever to protect Neil's future and support the family legacy. I hope we can move forward in a spirit of reconciliation. Perhaps over tea. Warmly. Heather, I didn't write back. That night, I sat by the fire and scribbled in my notebook. No plans this time. Just a heading. Things I no longer owe anyone. For justification, die silence la guilt. With my name on any account I don't control. The burden of being seen as less. I underlined that last one twice. Then I flipped to a clean page and wrote a name, Neil. Under it, I added a single sentence. If you want a relationship with me, it has to begin in truth. Nothing else will be accepted. I didn't send it. Not yet. Some silences need time to echo. On Wednesday, Neil called. The screen lit up just once. I stared at it until the ringing stopped. No voicemail, just quiet. And this time, I let it hold. The envelope arrived late Thursday afternoon, slipped neatly through the front door slot. It was thick, manila, unmarked except for my name in black ink. Scrawled, not printed, like someone had rushed to get it out before losing their nerve. I stared at it for a full minute. Then I set it on the kitchen table beside my tea, took a breath and opened it slowly with the same letter opener Robert had carved from cherry wood back in '85. Inside were 2 stacks of paper and a note. Mum, I didn't know everything. I see that now. But I want to make it right. Please read this before you decide to shut the door for good. Neil. I pushed the note aside and turned to the first document. Stack 1 printouts of bank records. The last 3 years of transactions, deposits, transfers. Neil had traced the monthly support payments he'd been sending to what he thought was a shared account. But they hadn't landed where he assumed. Because Heather had rerouted them. He'd trusted her to handle the paperwork. And she had, just not for my benefit. One transfer had gone toward a pilot's studio opening in downtown Lancaster. Another funded a weekend retreat in the Berkshires. $3,000 for land management consulting that led to a website I didn't understand and a photo of Heather smiling in a linen jumpsuit. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Stacked 2 emails. Printed exchanges between Heather and a real estate firm. Some casual, some disturbingly strategic. She won't put up a fight. She doesn't even know how the zoning works. I've convinced Neil it's for her benefit. The aging in place argument is gold. Once the state posts the eminent domain notice, she'll be grateful to have us handle it. I covered my mouth, not from shock, but from how unsurprised I was to read my own erasure in such confident type. I flipped to the last page. A typed letter from Neil. Mom, I've hired my own lawyer. Heather and I are separating. This isn't about money anymore. It's about clarity. About finally seeing the ways I stopped seeing you. I let someone else take over because it was easier than paying attention. I believed her when she said you were forgetful. That you needed our help. I let convenience become blindness. You've always been stronger than I gave you credit for. That's on me. If you don't want me in your life after this, I'll understand. But if there's room, even a corner, I'd like to earn my way back into it. Love, Neil. I sat still for a long time, hands flat on the table, heart somewhere between grief and release. There was a kind of justice in watching someone recognize the cost of their ignorance. But it didn't erase the ache, not the birthdays I spent alone while they sipped champagne in the city. Not the dinners where Heather steered every conversation away from the past. Not the way my own son had laughed at me. You're lucky we still pay for you. Some wounds don't close with paper apologies. I folded the documents back into the envelope and tucked it into the drawer beside my tea towels. Then I stood, poured the rest of my tea down the sink, and opened the back door. Snow had fallen lightly, just a dusting over the edge of the old swing set and the sloping hill behind the house. The back acre. The one I'd agreed to sell. But the part with the dogwood. The creek. The tree where Robert used to hang the wind chimes. That stayed mine, and always would. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Tom, I said, go ahead with the sale. Backlot only. Understood, he replied. Still no contact with Heather. No need to, I said. She already wrote my name out of the story. Now I'm just returning the favor. I spent that weekend packing up a few things. Not to leave, just to clear space. I donated old cookware to the shelter, boxed up Neil's high school trophies debate, cross-country, a participation ribbon from science fair. I didn't toss them. I just moved them to the attic. Some memories aren't bitter. They're just done. On Sunday, a knock came at the door. It was Ray, holding a brown paper bag and a smirk. I brought soup, he said, and news. He handed me the bag, potato leek still warm. Then a folder. The city had finalized the zoning map. My parcel, minus the protected section, had been approved for purchase. Funds would be deposited in 14 business days. Ray tilted his head. How's it feel? Clean, I said. He smiled. And Neil? Hayes, realizing, I said. That's something. It is. I agreed. But realization isn't redemption. That night, I sat by the window, watching the wind nudge the bare dogwood branches. And for the first time since this all began, I wrote Neil back. Not with forgiveness. Not with fury. Just the truth. I built this life with blistered hands and a full heart. You're welcome to walk beside me again. But not ahead, not above. And never holding the pen. I didn't know how to start the letter at first. There's a strange kind of paralysis that comes when you're trying to speak from both a broken place and a wiser one. To write to your child, not as a mother who nurtured, but as a woman who survived them. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee. No cream. No sugar. Just the bitter clarity I needed. Then I pulled out the thick ivory stationery. The kind Robert gave me one Christmas when he said, "Write the things you can't say out loud, Lil." I sat at the kitchen table with the dog snoring lightly at my feet and the sound of wind slipping through the porch cracks. And I began, Neil, you were born on a Tuesday morning in June, just as the sun pushed through the east window of the old maternity wing. I remember your cry, fierce, fast, hungry. And I remember thinking, this one will need a wide world to hold him. I was right. You've always reached for more. Even when you didn't see what you already had in your arms. When you were 8, you broke the fence chasing a baseball. I didn't yell. I just fixed the fence and made lemonade. You asked me later why I didn't punish you. Because you're still learning, I said. You're 44 now, Neil. Still learning. And so am I. I flipped the page, paused, and let the steam from my mug blur the edge of the ink before continuing. I've spent too much time lately counting the sacrifices I made, and not enough time remembering that I chose them. Not because I was forced, but because I believed in legacy. Not money. Not property. But the kind of legacy that teaches how to stand upright, how to return borrowed kindness, how to never leave someone wondering if they matter. You didn't steal my money, Neil. You stole my image from your life. And you handed that space to someone else to fill with their version of me. A version who needed help. Who couldn't manage. Who wouldn't notice. And that, more than the land, the deed, the transfer forms, is what you'll have to live with. Not because I wish you pain, but because I hope you never forget again. I paused to stretch my hand. My fingers ached more than they used to. Years of charting patience and folding hospital corners had left their imprint. Outside, a bird landed on the railing. Thin, puffed against the cold. I watched it shake off snow and fly again. Then I kept writing. Here's what I'm offering you. Not money, not land, not forgiveness on demand, but a second beginning. You may walk back into my life. But not as someone who assumes authority. Not as someone who speaks on my behalf. You come back as a son willing to listen, to ask before acting, to remember before forgetting again. We don't need to rewrite the past, Neil, but we do need to agree on how we hold it moving forward. If you want to talk, the porch light will be on every Sunday at 6. No need to call ahead. Just show up. No performative tears, no grand apologies. Just honesty. That's the only currency I accept now. Mum, I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it with a quiet kind of finality. Then I placed it near the back door, beside my gloves and the jar of keys no one uses anymore. That afternoon, I walked into town, stopped by the post office, bought a single forever stamp. The clerk, Sandra, smiled. Big letter today. Not big, I said. Just overdue. She winked, slid it into the outgoing bin, and handed me a receipt I didn't need. The next few days passed in the way quiet time always does, measured by sunrises and the creak of old floorboards. I made stew, washed linens, cleaned out the drawer where I used to keep birthday cards. Neil stopped sending. I didn't wait by the phone. I'd already said what needed saying. On Sunday, I lit the porch light at 5:58, just in case. I made tea for 2, just in case. By 16:15, the seat across from me remained empty. By 16:30, the tea had cooled. By 700, I poured his cup down the sink. But at 7:03, a car pulled into the driveway. Slow, hesitant, not his usual truck. A rental maybe. Neil stepped out. No coat, just a sweater. No Heather. Just him. He walked up the steps and stood there, unsure. I opened the door. You're late, I said. He smiled faintly. You still made tea. I nodded. I make it for people I don't expect. That way I'm never disappointed. He nodded, swallowed, and followed me in. As we sat, the tea steeping again between us, Neil reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. When he set it down, I gasped. It was my wedding ring. The one I had sold 30 years ago to pay his tuition. I didn't touch the ring for a full minute. It sat there between us on the kitchen table, still wrapped in the whisper of old tissue paper. The gold dulled with time, but unmistakably mine. I knew that band. Knew its small scratch on the inside, where Robert had once tried to fit both our initials in a space too tight. It had cost me my left ring finger for 30 years, and I had traded it without hesitation the winter Neil needed textbooks and boots. He had never asked where it went, until now. Neil cleared his throat. I found it on eBay of all places, he said softly. Took a while to confirm the engraving. Paid more than you did for it, I'm sure. I pressed the tissue flat, my fingers trembling. Why now? I asked, not looking up. He swallowed. Because you sold it for me? And I never asked why. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure I could. The memory of that December day. Standing in the pawn shop, snow in my hair, the clerk's impatient fingers, came rushing back like cold air through a cracked window. You needed it, I finally said. That was reason enough. But I never saw it, he whispered. Not the ring, not the cost. Not you. We sat in silence for a long time, the kind that wraps around old wounds, not to suffocate them, but to let them breathe. Then I picked up the ring, held it gently in my palm. It no longer fit. My hands had swollen with age and arthritis. But it didn't need to fit. It just needed to come home. Later that week, I met with Tom at the real estate office. The final papers were ready. The back acre, the portion closest to the planned expansion of Route 22, would be sold to the city for just over $1.47 million. The funds would be split part into my personal trust, part into a small fund I'd quietly started to support retired military nurses. You sure about this? Tom asked as I signed the last page. Yes, I said, flipping the document closed. I've let this land carry too many secrets. It's time it carried something good. The next few days were filled with boxes, dust, and a slow rhythm of goodbye. I packed only what mattered. The blanket Robert loved, the tea kettle that wheezed louder each year, my father's old field journal from 1944. I walked through each room like a woman leaving a church after a final prayer. The house had held so many versions of me. A young mother with cracked hands. A widow learning to sleep on one side of the bed. A woman dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, but never broken. Neil came by the night before I left. He didn't bring Heather. Didn't bring a speech. Just 2 arms and an offer. I'll help you load the last things, he said. We packed in silence. He lifted the heavy boxes without grumbling. I wrapped the glassware with old dishcloths, handed him memories wrapped in cotton. In the attic, I found a box labeled, Neil, High School. I placed it in his hands. He stared at the faded Sharpie letters, then at me. I don't deserve this grace, he murmured. It's not grace, I said. It's clarity. He nodded. We didn't hug, not yet. But something had already shifted. At dawn, I stood on the porch one last time. Snow dusted the steps, the railing, the wooden swing Robert had hung 35 years ago. I reached out and pushed it once, just to hear the familiar squeak. Then I turned the key in the lock, taped it to the doorframe. Whoever came next could start clean. But the story of this house would remain mine. I drove to the new place alone. A small cottage just outside Elizabethtown, 2 bedrooms, a porch with a swing already installed, and behind it, a trail that led to the Veterans Cemetery where Robert now rested beneath a sugar maple. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me like a quiet embrace. The living room was plain, cream walls, scuffed floors, but the light poured in through the windows like something holy. I opened every window, let the past out, let the quiet in. Then I made tea, 1 cup, and I set it on the counter beside a framed photo of Robert and me, our foreheads pressed together, our eyes laughing. That afternoon, I walked down to the cemetery with a folding chair and the letter I'd written months ago. A letter Robert never got to read. I sat beside his stone, brushed away a few stubborn leaves. You were right, I said aloud. He forgot. I placed the letter at the base of the stone. But he remembered, too, eventually. The wind answered me in rustling branches. And me, I added, smiling faintly. I didn't forget. I kept it safe. I touched the soil, the roots beneath, the quiet legacy built not in money, but in memory. That evening, I received a call from Ray. They finalized the public record, he said. It's official now. The house is sold, but the upper lot, with the creek, still yours. I looked out my new window at the distant hills. Good, I said. I planned to build something different on it, not with wood or stone, but with peace. The new cottage wasn't much, but it was mine. 2 bedrooms, sloped roof, creaky screen door that sang whenever the wind caught it just right. No marble, no granite, just wood, old, honest wood that smelled like pine dust and faint traces of lemon oil when the sun hit the floorboards around 2 p.m. What I loved most was the porch light. It wasn't motion sensor or smart, home linked. No fancy app, just a toggle switch hidden inside the hallway closet. The kind you had to press gently because the wiring was older than my knees. But it clicked on every evening at exactly 5:45. That's when Robert used to come home. I never said it aloud. Not to the neighbors. Not even to Neil. But that light wasn't just habit. It was memory. It was a small, glowing promise to the past. You are still welcome here. On the 3rd Sunday after I moved in, Neil showed up. No announcement, no flowers. Just a knock on the screen door and a pie in his hands. Store, bought, slightly burnt, still in the foil pan. I didn't have cinnamon, he muttered, eyes downcast. I poured 2 mugs of tea. English breakfast. We didn't speak for the first 15 minutes. He took a bite of pie, chewed slowly, then set the fork down and looked out toward the road, where maples stood bare, skeletons in winter light. I don't know how to be the version of me you used to believe in, he said. I looked at his hands. Long fingers, chewed nails, the small scar on his knuckle from falling off the bike I got him for his 8th birthday. Then start with the version who listens, I said softly. He nodded once. Not eagerly, but like someone willing to try. Before he left, he reached into the closet and flicked the porch light off. He didn't ask where the switch was. He just knew. A small gesture, but it rattled something inside me. The next week, he came again. This time, with black coffee and an old photo album. We sat at the kitchen table, turning page after page. Robert in his welding overalls. Me in the garden with a floppy hat and 2 missing front teeth. Neil as a toddler. Wrapped in a blanket he refused to let go of for 2 years straight. No talk of Heather. No mention of the brunch. We talked about how Robert used to whistle while shaving. How Neil once cried because a frog he caught looked lonely. We didn't heal everything, but we stitched around the edges. And sometimes that's enough. By the 5th Sunday, the silence between us felt comfortable, like a porch swing that had learned our rhythm. One afternoon, I found a note tucked into the mailbox. Written in a child's hand, misspelled and sweet. Are you the lady who used to live in the woods? My mom says you're brave. Later that day, a girl showed up at my back step. She had wild curls and a backpack shaped like a bee. She handed me a crayon drawing. A crooked little house with tulips in the yard and a woman with white hair holding a cane. Mom said you moved here after beating bad people, she whispered. I laughed, though my eyes burned. What's your name, honey? Ellie, she beamed. I want to be like you when I'm old. Well then, start with strong tea and soft eyes, I said. She came by every weekend after that, sometimes to draw. Sometimes just to sit on the porch swing and ask strange, beautiful questions. Do ghosts get cold? Why are grown-ups always tired? Do pancakes taste better when you're sad? I didn't always know the answers, but I always tried. Then one morning, a letter arrived from the county planning office. Plain envelope, thin paper, black serif type. Remaining parcel, proposed educational partnership. They wanted to turn the land behind my old home, the part I didn't sell, into a community garden. For veterans, for kids like Ellie. They asked if I'd consider being the namesake. I stared at the letter for a long time. Legacy doesn't always come with monuments. Sometimes, it's in soil, in raised beds of herbs, in benches where widows rest tired legs. That night, I turned on the porch light early. Not for Robert, not for Neil, not even for the memory of the woman I used to be. But for Ellie. For the girl with bee backpacks and questions about ghosts. For anyone who's ever needed a light to come home to. For me. I made tea before sunrise. Not out of habit, but for ceremony. It was the last Sunday of February. Light snow dusted the window panes, just enough to quiet the world. The kind of morning where the kettle's whistle felt like church bells. The house was still. No footsteps, no screen door creak, just me and the warmth slowly blooming in my hands. I pulled 2 mugs from the cabinet. Poured the first for myself. The second, I placed across the table. Then I waited, not anxiously, not with any expectation, just openly. The porch light was already on. Neil arrived at 6:02, no knock, just the sound of boots on the steps and a breath fogging the glass. When I opened the door, he held something in both hands. Not a gift, not a file, just the porch swing from the old house. I sanded it, he said, brushing off a bit of snow. Figured it didn't belong to anyone else. I stepped aside. We set it down in the corner of the porch where the light fell softest. The chain still squeaked like an old song half remembered. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw a man who wasn't trying to prove anything. He'd aged. Not in the face or the posture, but in the silence. There was humility in the way he folded himself into the porch chair. A slowness I hadn't seen since Robert. We didn't speak at first. Just sipped our tea. The steam curled between us like a quiet bridge. I never really knew how much you gave up, Neil said finally. I didn't answer. You never made it about you, even when it should have been. I set my cup down. You were my son. And you were a person, he said. I forgot that. Or maybe I never bothered to learn who you were outside of being mom. I looked down at the calluses on my hands, now softened with time. It's easy to ignore what holds you up, until it cracks. He swallowed. I wish I could take back the brunch. The accounts. Hither. I shook my head. No, I needed it to happen. All of it. He blinked. Why? Because it reminded me who I am, not someone's responsibility, not someone's burden, but someone who still chooses. I pulled a folded paper from my sweater. Unfolded it gently. It was the county's final approval for the educational garden. They'd added a name to the top in bold serif font. The Lillian O'Connell Legacy Plot for Community and Quiet Strength. Neil's eyes flickered. You said no to being erased, I said. Now I say yes to being remembered. He looked out at the sloping back lot, snow covering the dormant soil. There's going to be benches, I said softly. Raised beds for herbs. A flagstone path lined with cedar. And a sign that says, built by those who stayed. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I want to help. I raised an eyebrow. Not just with my hands, he said. With my time. With Ellie, if she wants to plant something. I smiled. She already picked her spot. She's 8, but she claims the sun loves her row best. He chuckled. After he left, I stood on the porch alone. Watched the snow begin to melt under the weak sun. I thought of Robert. Of every sacrifice folded into this land. Every hour I spent patching shingles, fixing pipes, chasing after a boy who now brought me burned pie and truth. I thought about forgiveness, not as a gift, but as a boundary. Not I forget, but I've learned, and I had, slowly, deeply, without fanfare. That afternoon, Ellie returned with a seed catalog and a glitter pen. We need purple carrots, she declared, and mint, and 1 flower just for bees. I handed her a notebook. Pick the name of your garden bed. She scribbled furiously. When I looked down, I saw Miss Lillian's laughing place. I laughed for real then. The kind that lingers in the chest. The days grew longer. The porch light still clicked on at 5:45, but it didn't feel like a vigil anymore. It felt like a welcome. Neil visited every week. Sometimes with mulch, sometimes with silence, always with both hands open. He never asked for forgiveness, and that was how I knew he'd earned it. One night, I sat by the garden alone. The cedar benches were in. The soil had been turned. There was a plaque waiting to be installed next week. The breeze carried the scent of new roots and old leaves. I sipped my tea slowly, and I whispered to the air. I stayed. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I didn't disappear. I chose myself. And I still had something left to give. If you've ever rebuilt from betrayal, not by burning bridges, but by planting something new, your story belongs here too. Leave a comment. Would you have forgiven Neil? Or would you have let silence be the final answer? Subscribe to Ian Rodadice to Orwai. For women who didn't fall apart, they simply rerouted. Spring came slowly that year, the kind that didn't burst in but tiptoed. Soft buds on branches, a cardinal's call echoing just before dawn, the soil warming beneath my steps. I spent most mornings walking the garden path in my old boots, a thermos of tea in hand. Ellie had planted her carrots, and they sprouted like shy secrets. Neil had installed a bench beside the mint bed. He didn't carve his name into it. He just left it clean, quiet, willing. One morning, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under a rock by the rosemary. Ellie's handwriting, crooked and fierce. I hope I grow up brave like you. I kept that note in my apron pocket all season. The garden filled slowly with neighbors, veterans, widows, children who had never touched soil with bare hands. No one asked me to speak, but they always left room beside them. That was enough. On Memorial Day, someone tied a small ribbon around the cedar post with my name on it. Purple, frayed at the edge. No card. I smiled. I didn't need to know who. There's a kind of power in not erasing what happened, but choosing what grows from it. And as I sit now on the porch swing Robert built, the wind brushing through new leaves, I no longer wait for someone to arrive. I sit here because I am already home. Because legacy isn't what we pass down in things. It's what we plant in others, quietly, without needing applause. And every time the porch light flickers on, it's not a beacon for the lost anymore. It's a light for those who've found their way back to themselves.